welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm your host, Sam Stern. Thank you so much for all of you who have listened to Voices of Esalen thus far and subscribed to it. We're new, so you are the early listeners. Please tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everyone you know about us. And if you feel motivated, you could even leave a review on iTunes. It doesn't have to be a 5-star review. It could be a 5-star review, but it doesn't have to be. You know, anything honest helps. Just getting the word out there. That's how you can support Voices of Esalen at this moment. So thank you so much for your support. If you like what you're hearing, we like doing it for you. So our guest today is Michaela Boehm, a wonderful, articulate, very provocative teacher. She was at Esalen in the fall doing a course called The Wild Woman's Way. In our discussion, we really dug into her teaching and in particular polarity and sexual chemistry, especially as that pertains to long-term relationships. Michaela let me know why polarity is important and how to preserve it. So there's a lot to think about from her teaching, a lot to learn. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you disagree. She was so forthcoming and really admire her candor and her free thought. So with no further ado, here's my conversation with Michaela Boehm. Hi, Michaela. How are you today?
I am good. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you so much for joining us on Voices of Esalen. I thought I would start the interview by asking you just a bit about your teaching. When you were here in the fall, I think the name of your workshop was The Wild Woman's Way, and I wanted to ask you about that and what you taught there.
Yeah, well, I actually taught 2 in a row. I taught The Wild Woman's Way, which is a body of work I've developed, and I can talk about that in a second. And I also taught the Yoga of Deep Intimacy, which is the application of that kind of work for both men and women on how to create intimacy and deal with the requirements of keeping polarity or sexual chemistry alive and that body of work. So I do both of them each year at Esalen.
Okay, let's start with The Wild Woman's Way.
Yeah. Well, it's a big topic simply because I've had a teacher since I was very young, and that my first teacher was a woman, and I studied with her for about 11 or 12 years, very intensively. The last year I went back and forth between the States and Europe, so it wasn't quite as full on anymore. But my background is in a kind of a tantric, Kashmiri tantric yoga tradition. And then, of course, I traveled and taught with David Data for 13 years. And I developed a lot of the exercises that are used in the workshops, during that time, in the women's part of the workshops. And that premise or the background of The Wild Woman's Way is a combination of both the time I spent with my first teacher and the time I spent on the road and teaching in the U.S. with David, and as well by myself. In the last 8 years, I've been traveling extensively with this particular program. My inspiration essentially came from my background in Jungian psychology, where the wild woman, is an archetype. And one of my heroes ever since I was 15 or 16 was Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who, of course, wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves, which is all about the wild woman archetype. And so in the course of my own studies and my own explorations and, my background in Jungian psychology, I wanted to create something that dealt with the actual physical embodiment of that particular archetype and the exploration around that, because a lot of us have lost that part of us. And how wild woman is to be understood is not wild and crazy and all fangs and claws, even though that could be part of it, but it's connected to nature, our wildish nature, how Clarissa Pinkola says. So it's kind of a rewilding of one's essential self or one's essential nature, which looks different in each human. This is particularly for women solely because women's bodies have different requirements around, human sexuality and women's sexuality and pleasure and birthing and, all of those kind of things. So rewilding looks a bit different with men. I teach men's workshops around that topic as well, but the Wild Woman's Way is specifically for women's bodies, women's psyches, and it enables each woman through a process of movement and dance and art. We do these beautiful art projects, and of course Esalen's Art Barn always features a prominent role in the 5-day, because it's amazing to be able to go there and as a group of women create art that represents their individual inquiries and their individual expressions. So it's a very beautiful 5-day project to do at Esalen, because we use the baths one evening where we do singing and poetry and bath treatments as a group. We use the art barn, we use the property. So it's a very beautiful place to do this workshop.
So I'm curious, by the end of the workshop, how does one of the women who's participated in your class know that she has been rewilded?
It's pretty apparent, because the rewilding is essentially a coming back to who you really are, and her particular access to that. So some of the symptoms, so to speak, that people experience is a much stronger connection to the body, a much stronger connection to the instinctive, intuitive aspects of oneself, the feeling aspect of oneself, connection to other women, connection to nature, connection to individual self-expression. And it looks different in different women. Some women sing, some women dance, some women paint, some women just become very connected to, other women in the group. But a sure sign is always the connection to the body, a certain relaxation and openness, an intuitive feeling of what's happening with other people and with oneself and the surroundings. So those are the symptoms, so to speak.
Okay. And then you transition into teaching with men and women together in the other part of your program. Do you find a difference?
Well, it's also very different, because during a 5-day, particularly when we speak about Esalen, right, during a 5-day, it's a very different environment than during a weekend. A lot of people who come for a 5-day, they come specifically to immerse, and they come wanting to be in that particular program. And because it's only women, we can build a very strong community and a very strong feeling of a group and connectedness. And it's very beautiful to see how the women sit in the dining area together and they do things together. And of course, when you then bring men in and people come as couples, that's very different, because of course one of the things about the weekend workshop is that it deals with the dynamics of sexual relationships, sexual attraction, intimacy, how to create strong sexual polarity. So people come specifically with their mate, and that makes them want to be with their mate and not so much in larger groups or communities. And then people who come as single participants might have partners at home, so they're not as prone to hang out as much. And then, of course, some people come as singles and they connect with other people. But it's a very different feeling during a weekend than it is during a women's workshop, for the reasons I just mentioned, and also because the topic's very different.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned couples, and I wanted to ask, do you see a common denominator for couples who have a long-lasting sexual attraction?
Yes, they usually don't spend much time together. I mean, that sounds funny, but that's actually very true. The people I know, both, now mind you, of course, right, I've been a counselor for over 20 years, and I've taught workshops for a good 15, and, before that I taught other things. So I, of course, am in the position to see people who have issues. Right? You don't go to the doctor unless you're sick. So often I get to see people who have trouble in their relationships, but not always, because I also work just with sexual things and people who want to increase the depth of their relationship, but there's nothing really wrong. But mostly I would say what makes people not stay together is the loss of polarity in the relational sexual domain. And then, of course, things like, financial issues and issues of addiction and other related things are, the main reasons people don't stay together.
You mentioned polarity. I'm wondering if it's obvious or we need to define it. And I also wanted to pose to you, what are some ways that you lose polarity besides spending a great deal of time together?
Yeah, well, I think, to define polarity, there has been a lot of pop culture reference to the terms masculine and feminine in the last 10 years or so, in particular the last 5. So it's very important to understand that masculine and feminine are not the same as men and women. Right? Each human being has both in them, and each human being has aspects of them that are more, when we say masculine, what we're talking about is directed, focused, purposed, organized in a time-space grid, having an overview of where it's going, the part of us that observes, the part of us that witnesses, the part of us that, can kind of keep a head above the fray while it's happening and has a linear forward movement. That part of, in all of us, we call the masculine. The part in all of us that's wildly creative, non-linear, somewhat chaotic at times, immersed in life and, flowing with life, that's the feminine. And so in each human there is both, because otherwise we wouldn't function. But each human has kind of a natural place which they, thrive the most or are the happiest in. And that place could be called one's sexual essence, is what David Data calls it. So one's sexual essence, by the way, he pioneered this kind of work, way, way back when. And it's, of course, since then been taken by many people and interpreted in many different ways. But in its essential way, polarity is described as the attraction between two poles. And in relationship, the two poles would be one person animating their masculine essence and one person animating their feminine essence. Now, who is who doesn't really matter, but most people have a preference. So they rest naturally in their masculine, or they rest naturally in their feminine. So they prefer animating and enjoying life through the body to finding the depth of consciousness in stillness, or the other way around. Right? So you could say whoever amplifies the feminine essence immerses fully in life with the body, through the environment, through their actions, and whoever animates the masculine is the conscious witness to life happening. Right? And so what that means sexually, though, and what the only thing that's important about that sexually, when we talk about polarity, is that one partner takes on the characteristics, the bodily characteristics of one part of that, and the other one takes on the characteristics of the other pole. And then those two poles create an arc of attraction or an arc of polarity, like a north and a south, a minus and a plus. Okay. Then you have a sexual chemistry. Now, the problem is that most people, when they spend time together, and I've spoken about this extensively, and so have other people. So I'm just going to give you a very quick summary. But relationship is built on sameness. Polarity is built on opposite aspects. So when people get into relationship, they start out by not knowing each other, and it's very exciting, and they're very different. And then as they enter a relationship, most people start moving in together, start spending time together, start having friends in common, and so on and so on. So they create more and more sameness, which is very beautiful for the sake of furthering the intimacy and the connection in the relationship, but it's counteractive to the art of polarity, which is built on people being very separate from each other. So this brings us back to how do couples who have good relationships survive in the sexual polarity? Well, they know that when you spend too much time together, it's like two magnets rubbing each other off. You lose the different aspects. And so most people who have intact, interesting sexual spark have separate interests, separate, friends, spend time apart, do things that make them interesting to their intimate partner, and they don't spend every moment, sitting together on the sofa watching TV, which is the ultimate buzz killer for sexual attraction.
Are there any other ways that we are in danger of losing polarity with our partner besides spending too much time together? Is there something that that is somehow different than this, which is also dangerous to the polarity?
I'd say, processing, spending too much time talking about things that are better talked about with therapists or friends. That's a big one. That happens a lot, where people treat each other as their best friends, which is very lovely, but it certainly destroys sexual polarity. The kind of rule of thumb is always that when you could speak with a girlfriend or a male friend about it, when it's an issue, a problem, or something you need to process, you better process with a therapist or with a friend and not with your partner.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you've discussed other ways to recreate polarity and emphasize a very decent, or better than decent sexual attraction for couples who want to stay together.
Well, a lot of the things I teach center around creating that, because essentially sexual polarity follows the same rules of physics, right? One polarizes the other. So if somebody goes very strongly with their body into the domain of the masculine, the other partner's body will automatically soften into the feminine. The nice thing about these things is that they're instant. Right? Now, the emotional, psychological aspects, resentment or past patterns, that's hard to fix, but the actual chemistry, the actual polarity, that's almost instantaneous when you know what you do. So you can learn with your body to animate, let's say, stillness and movement, or depth and energy, or pleasure in the body, and this kind of meditative stillness that meets it. So those things can be learned, and it doesn't take very long to learn them. But so for anybody listening who isn't in the middle of a workshop right now, that one of the ways to look at it is simply to work with one's body in a way that creates a certain kind of somatic expression of whatever their essence is. And that in itself makes a huge difference.
One thing that comes up from listening to you is, Esalen is located near the Bay Area, and I would say that the Bay is probably one of the world's leading centers where polyamory is popular, right? So I'm not a big fan of it because I think it gets things too complicated and it creates issues of jealousy. But I'm curious how your school of thought kind of plays in with the school of thought around polyamory, because it seems they have similar goals at least.
I'm not so sure if we could say similar goals, because it's a big issue, and recently a lot of interviews and lots of talks have kind of focused on it, and I've certainly reversed my position on a few things in the last, I would say, five years or so, simply because conventional relationship as it was done for many, many years has really never worked that well for reasons we can go into, one of which is it's a fairy tale to believe that two humans who live 50, 60, 80, 90 years nowadays will stay together during that whole period. Now, my parents are going to be married for 50 years this year, and my grandparents were married for 65 or so. So it's definitely doable, and people do it, but comes with a very specific price if you want to have that kind of relationship. Most people nowadays, and particularly in the context of women's liberation and men having a very different role in society nowadays than from even 10 years ago, the idea that one partner will fulfill it all with the complex lives we have these days is not that likely. Right? Mm. So I'm not a big fan of polyamory either, for the exact same reasons you described, which is that for the right to have sex with whoever you want to have sex with, you pay the price of constant processing, constant engagement, constant talking, and it becomes kind of a lifestyle just through that. Now, mind you, there's some people who handle things very differently, but not everybody has the time it takes to do as much conscious processing as it takes to keep the show on the road. Also, of course, it enables you to spread your attention, your consciousness wide instead of deep, because you can always just go somewhere else when it becomes a bit dicey or a bit, too close to the bone. But once again, these are generalizations. There's people who do really well with multiple relationships in different situations. I would say that when you look at relationship as a means, and sex, like relationships and sex as a means to growth, then you could explore that growth in a variety of situations. In a one-on-one committed relationship, if you commit to that particular trajectory of growth, there isn't a way out. You don't get a relief. And that can be very useful if you have the guts and the kind of propensity to want to look at your patterns of relating that's, handed down to you from your parents and all
right.
of that. Then a one-on-one relationship is a really, really great way to go. And anyone who has been married for a long time, I've been married now for over 10 years, so I've known my husband for, I think, close to 15. I can tell you that that's a whole other, kettle of fish or whatever you want to call it. That takes a whole other inquiry to maintain long-term relationship, honestly. And it's not all roses, and anyone who's been married for a while knows there's whole years where you definitely question that decision, and then it's amazing again, and then it gets really bizarre, and then, so it's a great tool for a certain kind of an inquiry. Now, there's other tools for inquiry, and one of them is to have different partners for different aspects of your life, not all of them sexual, but to perhaps not put so much responsibility on one partner to fulfill you in all domains, right? And there's also schools of thought that says you need to be perfectly happy with yourself before you even enter into any relationship. But most people don't. If they wait that long, they won't ever have relationships. So, I don't think there's one answer. I do think, though, that the people who I have met, mostly who are polyamorous, often bypass certain aspects for the sake of addressing others, but we all do that, so what do I know? My personal preference is certainly to keep it a little bit more simple than that.
Yes, right. I'm curious, what would you say is the average age of the of your students who come to the couples workshops?
It's really, I would say it runs the whole gamut because I personally have no age requirements other than legal age, and my co-teacher, the man I teach with these days, is much younger than I am. So between the people that he attracts and the people that I attract and the people who are just naturally in the age where they want to work on relationships, I'd say early 20s till late 70s, but with a core group of probably 30 to 50 or 55.
If you had a view on pornography or sexual media, I don't know whether to call it pornography or sexual media or if there's a difference, but the stuff that is available out there, can you envision this stuff helping, and if not, can you envision a kind of sexual media that plays into empowered roles for the sex?
Well, there is certainly a way to use pornography in a very beneficial way. And I have a few clients with whom I've specifically worked on that, private clients. But, of course, the thing to be said, generally speaking, and I see this a lot with, younger participants, both in the men's and the women's groups, report, a very strong desensitization. And as you probably know, it's a huge problem in young male adults. The need for sexual stimulants, medications at times, because there's such a strong desensitization, and it's so available from such a early age that it does influence the nervous system in a way that can't be described as entirely beneficial, to say it very lightly. And also a view of how people should look and act and behave sexually that's very incorrect as we know. But and also when you look at sexual conduct in teenagers, things that when I grew up were considered incredibly out there or taboo or weird are completely mainstream based on sexual media. And sexual acts that were considered somewhat out there are performed happily by 16, 17, 18-year-olds and younger at times. So that said, of course, there's a huge downfall to pornography that can't be denied. However, if put in the right context, one of the ways that pornography can be kind of interesting to look at is that, of course, evolutionarily speaking, just from a biological evolutionary psychology standpoint, we as men and women, regardless of what feminism or men's liberation or women's liberation say, as human beings, biologically speaking, we're built differently. We have different sexual organs, and we have different roles as far as the survival of the species. And so in a man, what facilitates survival of the species is the willingness and ability to inseminate and impregnate as many young, fertile women as humanly possible. And so that's what the body wants to do, and it doesn't matter if you evolve, and you can evolve, both psychologically and spiritually, but your body as a male body is built to ejaculate quickly, as often and as much and with as many different women as humanly possible. And I don't know if you know this, one of the interesting things about all male mammals is that the more stress they are under, the more they want to ejaculate. And the reason for that, of course, is that you want to procreate before you die. So in a tribal situation in the cave days, if there was a war coming or a neighboring tribe or a famine, the best you could possibly do is make sure that you deposited some genetic code somewhere that it could be carried forth. So that's why there's so much rape and sexual violence and, in war, because that kind of stress of we are going to die in a male mammal and certainly in a male human produces the wantingness to ejaculate.
That's pretty fascinating perspective. You could
really amazing, isn't it?
It's crazy. You could envision the whole excess of really bad porn that's out there as this kind of like death cry in the late stages of capitalism as our society collapses. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, you could look at it like that. There's other reasons too, which I'll mention in a second, because this is a super fascinating topic, right? So that's what men are built for. So that's why men, in their very nature, regardless of their social conditioning and spiritual conditioning, the body wants to have a variety of young, fertile women, and of course the variety is not being taken into account when you get married to one woman. So in women, something else, I'll come back to this in a second, in women something else happens entirely. A woman's body's main responsibility in the realm of survival of the species is to maintain enough body weight to ovulate, maintain a pregnancy, and breastfeed. And so women in stressful /war/death situations eat carbs, ideally, right? Because in the wilderness, the hardest thing to come by were carbs. There was no 7-Eleven corner stores or anything of that nature, so you needed to get berries or honey or whatever you could get that was starchy or carb-rich, to maintain ovulation, to maintain your pregnancy, to maintain the ability to breastfeed. Finding many young, fertile men was fairly low on the priority because you only needed to be impregnated once every 9 months. Then you needed a man who could actually provide food and sustenance and shelter and safety for you and the offspring. So while men are highly visual, looking for nice ass, women look for money, power, sustenance. And that hasn't changed as much as we'd like for it to have changed. And it has, because we can make our own living nowadays and all of that. But the body still goes, this is what I need for me and my offspring to survive. So that all said, and you can also once again see, link between women and Haagen-Dazs and things like that, right? They're more stressed, they're more eating. Now, nowadays women are so disciplined around, or many women, not all women, but many women are super disciplined around eating, so that impulse has gone into shopping, or shoes or makeup or clothing and stuff like that. But a man's relationship to sex is like a woman's relationship to her clothes or her makeup or her shoes. It's all about the variety. So when a man is in a monogamous relationship, he still has the same impulse to look at women and desire them, at least for a second as he walks by. And, of course, when you are in a monogamous relationship, that becomes a bit like you're having pizza every night, which is great for the first week or two. But after that, there's a biological need for variety.
What I think is interesting about you and what you're saying is that you're hardly painting an idyllic picture of monogamy, and yet you've been married for 10 years and been with the same partner for 15.
Yeah. But
so
I have supplementation, so to speak, and and so does my husband. Not sexual supplementation necessarily, but I have a variety of very good male support in other domains where I'm not expecting for my husband to do it all and be it all. And the same thing for my husband. My husband teaches traditional Thai massage and yoga therapy. So to say it very bluntly, he spent a great deal of time touching and massaging different women's bodies. Right? So he is certainly not deprived of different energies. Now, you don't have to take it sexual. It's, I mean, we're all fairly civilized human beings nowadays. You don't have to actually, hump everything that moves. You have control over it. But your base need for variety as a man never subsides unless, your testosterone goes to zero. And your base need as a woman for direction and support and, power supplied by an external source in some way or another never subsides. And so porn, is one way that men could potentially, if they know how to use it healthily, supplement without having to cheat or without having to do weird stuff. And other sexual media, which doesn't really exist quite yet. The closest we've come to something being mainstream sexual media for women has probably been romance novels and 50 Shades of Grey, which is like fast food. But it's a movement in that direction.
Yes, no, very well said.
But I definitely, for many other reasons, prefer being with one man in the situation that I am. But I by no means have a conventional marriage. That's I don't live with my husband for most of the year. He has a separate place on the same property, and we both travel extensively. So if we see each other a week, a month, that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Each couple has to decide what works for them. What works for me and my husband would not work for most people.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
So where do you think is the best place to teach about sexuality? I was going to ask you, do you find Esalen to be, in its essence, a sexual place or non-sexual or medium?
I think I would not categorize Esalen as a sexual place in its design or purpose, but it's an open place and it's a very, both rich in history and progressive place. So, when I grew up in Austria, so far away from Esalen, but I was very much into Alan Watts and Suzuki Roshi and all kinds of different things that would happen on the as well on the west coast of the U.S. And of course, I was born after those things took place, but I was very young when those things took place. But I look at Esalen as both the cradle of the kind of movement that we all, particularly here on the West Coast, are now benefiting. And at the same time, I think Esalen has never stopped opening up to, different views and different experimentations, and there's always an openness for new things and the next development. So it's a great place to teach simply because the environment is one that allows for great self-expression of the participants, but it also has enough of a structure so people can feel held and safe. And then, of course, just the beauty and the lushness of the environment, just walking across the gardens there with all the, the marigolds and looking out on the ocean and the kind of food that's provided and the baths make it a very sensual place. I wouldn't say sexual per se. You could take it sexual then, but it's an incredibly sensual, beautiful and beauty-filled, place that enables a full-bodied exploration of any kind.
Yes. Well, I just have a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you, why do you teach? What is it about teaching that's gratifying or essential for you?
That's a good question. The reason I'm going, there's so much to be said. I would say that my wantingness or willingness to teach is kind of the thing that gets me up in the morning. You know, I'm kind of built to want to give the things that I've learned and give the things that I have an expertise in. And so teaching and transmitting the knowledge that I've been given. And I've recently also become the lineage holder of the woman who taught me to begin with. But that kind of giving forth is kind of in my blood and bones in a certain way. And so that's kind of the primary motivation, is that I don't know how I would exist if I couldn't give the things that were taught to me both by my teachers and by my parents as well, and my heritage couldn't be given forth. And then the other part is that the areas of human sensuality, sexuality, women's culture, women's movement, the new emerging men's culture, all of those aspects of human development are not really taught in school and not taught in families. So
that's true.
And so I'm very passionate about that particular field because it's one of the few areas that you don't get taught in. I mean, most people get taught, an instrument, math, how to balance the checkbook, at least if they were, parented moderately well. You get taught things in school, but nobody teaches you about sex, about how to, have a marriage. We're supposed to pick that up from our parents who don't all have the best marriages. And so it's super important for me to make sure that these things are addressed and people get a chance to learn properly.
Well, what's one mistake that you used to make while teaching that you don't make anymore?
Oh, God. I would say, teaching is, if you're honest, teaching is a constant mistake in a certain way, simply because every time, when I look back, every time I teach, I realize that something I taught could have been taught different or with more depth or from a different angle. So it's an ongoing process to teach a living tradition to living human beings. So that said, though, I think one of the mistakes that I used to make, that I certainly try to avoid these days, is that you cannot protect people from their patterns or their karma as much as you want to as a teacher, because as a counselor as well. Because of course, from the outside, it's fairly apparent what's going on, and you can, of course, with a bit of skill and knowledge and with the right kind of agreement, influence somebody's past substantially. And sometimes that's a very good thing, but sometimes you find out later on that the learning had to happen exactly how it had to happen, and that trying to spare people certain experiences just means they'll come back to them later on, because everyone has to make their own learning mistakes and learn through experience, and that you can't spare anyone from that.
No. Is there anything that you find embarrassing to talk about in your workshops around the sexual arena? I mean, because it is a topic that can bring up embarrassment.
No.
Nothing's off limits. How about this? Is there something that you find that men are embarrassed to speak about, or embarrassed to a subject that's embarrassing to broach within your classes?
Yeah, I would definitely say the reason I'm saying no is, I've traversed that whole area both personally and in my teaching for a long time, and I both have a fairly filthy mind and a filthy mouth, and I've also heard it all. I remember in the beginning of my counseling sessions, I'd go, "You did what? What?" But nowadays, I've heard every configuration and position that you can possibly imagine, and I think it's very important to speak about these things very cleanly and clearly, so that people lose their shame around it. I would definitely say most people don't want to admit that they have sexual problems of any kind. With men, of course, there's always the issue of performance and erection and things like that. And I think a lot of people are very hesitant, and rightly so, particularly in workshops where there's, you never know. I mean, nowadays, you also have to take into account that people might be recording stuff on their cell phones and, all kinds of things that make people be less forthcoming. But I think sexual fantasies that people have, or explorations that are considered, somewhat out of the ordinary, is still the area where people, are somewhat hesitant. Now, my workshops deal mostly with how do you create the strongest attraction and the deepest intimacy. So people don't usually go into nitty-gritty sexual stuff. In my private sessions, when my teaching partner and I do private sessions, we sometimes deal with those things in depth, because it's private and between that person and us, or that person and their partner and us. And in those contexts, often sexual performance is the thing that's, the last bastion of embarrassment.
Yes, definitely. Well, fantastic. Thank you for a beautiful exploration of your work, Michaela. I'm wondering if our listeners want to explore more about what you do. How can they find out more?
Well, I have a website. So it's M as in Mary, ICHAELA, B as in boy, OEHM as in Mary. So it's michaelaboehm.com. And on that website is absolutely everything I do. This year I'm doing quite extensive teaching both on West and East Coast, in Australia and in Europe. So there's lots and lots of different programs, men's groups, women's groups. This year I'm teaching a couple of very in-depth sexual yoga trainings, 5-day trainings as well. I have long-term study groups, apprenticeships, recordings on the website, you name it, it's there.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Michaela.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Voices of Esalen. You can find us on iTunes or go to the Esalen website. That's ESALEN.org. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Cheryl Franzel, our Director of Programs, Geraldine Hess, Programs Manager, Shannon Hudson is our Webmaster, and Lori Putnam is our Director of Marketing. I'm your host, Sam Stern, wishing you deep happiness and strength on your path.